thank you very much for your welcome and your kind words, and indeed for the honor that you do me by this prestigious invitation. It's a delight to be with you. And I'm excited to share some recent reflections, but those reflections have got roots in my earlier work. And these reflections are cognate with and going on beyond the Gifford Lectures, which I did in Aberdeen last year, and which are in the process of appearing in published form now. And there's an advanced copy of that on the bookstall, not to buy, but to goggle at while it's, make sure you, and there's some flyers to make sure you can order it, etc. And the topic is about the epistemology of love. Loving to Know is my title. And this goes back some way, but when I was slated to do the Giffords, I remember visiting my mother, and I tell this story in the book. I visited my mother, who was in her 93rd year at the time. She has now passed away, but she was full of years and grace. And she said, "Tom, you're doing these Giffords, what are they about?" And I said, "Well, it's natural theology, Mum." "Natural theology? What's that?" And I said, "Well, some people used to think that you could start with the natural world and argue up to God. And some people have actually thought that's not a very good way of doing it and it might not work. And I think that they've missed out talking about Jesus in the middle of that. And if we put Jesus back into the question, we might not only be able to do it differently, we might find out something about knowledge itself." And I thought, phew, that's enough for a 93-year-old. And she thought for a moment, and then she said firmly, "I'm glad I don't have to listen to those lectures." And I think I did say at the time, "Thanks, Mum, you've just given me my first line." And so it was. Anyway, I've become increasingly realizing that in many spheres, the question not just of what we know, but of how we know it is really important and urgent. And this applies to the gospel and to scripture themselves. So I've tried, like some others, to develop this notion of love as the ultimate form of knowledge and to explore its wider relevance. My history with this goes back to the 1980s. After a decade of teaching undergraduates, I was increasingly concerned by the deep distortions that I was seeing in my own primary discipline, which is New Testament studies. And these distortions could be traced again and again to particular roots within the philosophy and especially the epistemology of the Enlightenment. And most biblical scholars don't usually stop and think about philosophical presuppositions. They do that down the hall in a different department. Biblical scholars tend to plunge straight into the texts, often assuming a positivism in which we can know or try to know straightforwardly what is true and what isn't true, generating the sharp distinction between the sure and certain results of scientific research on the one hand, which is often a very slimmed down and reductionist account, and the fluid, uncertain world of possible theological meanings on the other. And the former is supposedly objective, and the latter, again, supposedly subjective, mere pious speculation, or as it may be, impious speculation. Now, this sharp distinction reflects the other way up, as it were, the famous 18th century divide characterized by G.E. Lessing as the broad and ugly ditch between the supposedly eternal truths of reason and the contingent truths of history, a distinction in part ontological and in part epistemological. You might, in other words, start from above. It's rather like the way I explained it to my mum. You might start from above and attempt to discover the eternal truths of reason by beginning with lofty intuitions and thinking rationally about their implications. But that Platonic truth quest would never join up with the messy, accidental, contingent events in the world of space, time, and matter. Conversely, if you started with those contingent events, you'd never get to the eternal truths. This great divide, reflected in the work of Kant, eventually produced, to cut a very long story right down to the bone, the disastrous but highly influential theories of Rudolf Bultmann. about which I've written elsewhere. Indeed, just as you told me that my predecessor in giving this lecture was none other than Joseph Ratzinger, so the previous New Testament scholar to do the Gifford lectures in 1955 was Rudolf Bultmann. So I figured if we Neue Testamenters get a shot at doing this roughly every 55 years or so, I have to try to make it count. So there we are. And part of the disaster which concerns English speakers is that in our world, which has been largely ignorant of Bultmann's neo-Kantianism and existentialist Lutheranism, that our world simply picked up that this learned German had cast doubts on much of the gospel story, particularly on Jesus' resurrection. And that was then translated into the pragmatic, though brittle, positivism of English and American liberalism, which wanted to doubt these events for quite other reasons. And this reinforced, particularly in America, the division between liberal and conservative, which has played out so disastrously in other spheres. And again, there are many tales to be told along these lines, but not tonight. My purpose here is simply to indicate what I mean in identifying multiple confusions at the level of epistemology underneath the confused world of modern biblical scholarship. Now, as a historian, and that was my primary training, I knew in my bones that this either-or of objective history and subjective meaning was a gross oversimplification. In my 1992 book, The New Testament and the People of God, it's extraordinary to think that that is 27 years ago, or whatever it was, I suggested, in the light of a broad historical survey of the early Jewish and Christian worlds, that we needed a better integration which would transcend the false and over-bright antithesis of objective and subjective. I had been introduced to the idea of critical realism through the work of Bernard Lonergan, whom I encountered in the writing of my one-time friend Ben Meyer, now long late and lamented. And in that context, I met what they called an epistemology of love. And though I'm not a Lonergan scholar, there's a lot of Lonergan. Now that I'm coming up to semi-retirement, maybe it's time I actually sat down with Lonergan for 6 months. That might be fun. But ever since then, I've been trying to understand what an epistemology of love might mean, and not just understand it, but hopefully put it into practice. And as I've done so, I've realized that it isn't only in biblical studies that the Enlightenment's epistemological proposals have resulted in false antitheses. In my Gifford lectures, I laid out the ways in which the questions of so-called natural theology on the one hand, and the historical study of Jesus on the other hand, have both become dangerously detached from one another. And this isn't just because we have now discovered in some objective sense something about natural theology or about the history of Jesus, which means that they must be pulled apart or kept apart. It's because both questions and any idea of any link between them have themselves been distorted by the larger epistemological climate of the Enlightenment. And my proposal is that by paying attention to Jesus as a real figure of first century history, we can, despite the shrill chorus of naysayers, both radical and conservative, we can point some ways forward for the church and through the church for our misguided and muddled world. And for all this, and for the multiple resultant tasks in theology and mission, we need to understand and put into practice new ways of knowing, specifically a robust epistemology of love. As a taster, let me amplify something I've said elsewhere. Rusty mentioned my book on the resurrection, and that remains central to this project. Enlightenment thought rejected Jesus' resurrection, not because of a supposedly new scientific awareness that dead people don't rise. Sometimes critical scholars have said, we now know that Jesus didn't rise because we've been doing critical history for 200 years, to which the response is, excuse me, Homer knew that the dead don't rise. This is not a new insight. And the Enlightenment's real reason was, get it, if Jesus rose from the dead, that event in itself has a claim to be the turning point of world history, but the Enlightenment was claiming that status for itself. It says so on your dollar bills, Novus Ordo Seclorum. There cannot be two great world turning points. So the Enlightenment, having claimed that, then rules out resurrection because it would blow the whistle on its claim. But underneath that lies the crucial epistemological battle, because the Enlightenment was deeply enthralled to that split-level epistemology, which, by insisting on hard facts on the one hand and creaming off everything into a subjective sphere on the other, was able to live into Francis Bacon's maxim that knowledge is power. I can't resist telling you there was an article in the London Times maybe a month or so ago, by one of the leading journalists who said that he had a friend who had heard somebody say, knowledge is power, Francis Bacon, and had realized, okay, I understand knowledge is power, but what's the other half of this mean? Because he didn't realize it was a name. He thought it was a three-word sentence, France is Bacon. And but the point about knowledge is power is this, that knowledge of the Enlightenment's sort, we know the way the world is and we're going to impose that knowledge on you, became the underlying instrument for the imperial projects of the modern West. But that kind of knowledge fails to do justice to the ultimate realities of the world. And it fails in a second-order way to grasp or to be grasped by the ultimate reality itself, which is the resurrection of Jesus as the launch of new creation in the midst of the old. As Wittgenstein himself said remarkably, it is love that believes the resurrection. And many of our current ills, social, political, and cultural, have emerged from our ignoring this or trying to bypass it. That is the burden of my song tonight. But first, we must look a little more closely at the Enlightenment settlement itself and some of its more disturbing results. Following various analysts, I see the Enlightenment not simply as a secularist movement, but actually as epicurean, namely a modern retrieval of an ancient philosophy. That identification, which, as I say, has been made by many different writers on the subject, enables us to highlight various things which, if you just say secular, that label screens these things out, particularly the fact that modern Western culture is not a new thing based on modern science, as is so often assumed, is actually an ancient worldview with some modern bells and whistles. In the ancient world, Epicureanism was very much a minority position. If you wanted to be a serious Epicurean, it helped if you had a nice vineyard and compliant slaves and a few other things like that. It's an aristocratic thing, as it still is. In the 18th century, it attained not only majority status in the Western world, but also worldview status, in the sense that most Westerners to this day, including, alas, many Christians, don't even realize that they are looking at the world through Epicurean spectacles. And by Epicurean here, I'm referring principally to cosmology, not ethics, though the ethics come too. The cosmology goes like this: the gods may exist, but they're in an entirely different sphere to ourselves. They take no notice of us, and they certainly don't intervene in our world. The other meanings of Epicureanism are relevant eventually, but not primary here. There is then an easy commerce between the hard-edged split in Epicureanism of heaven and earth and the more flexible deism embraced by many, particularly in America. And many modern thinkers, like their ancient counterparts, have been quite flexible in combining bits and pieces of technically different philosophies. Like Seneca, who's a Stoic, was able to borrow from Epicureanism and just made a joke of it. Yeah, well, if it's true, even if those guys said it, and so on. So it's happened that way in the modern world as well. But Epicureanism commended itself to Enlightenment thinkers because part of their impetus was a deep-seated antipathy to top-down social, political, cultural, and religious systems in church and state, which were perceived, especially in France and America, as a stultifying denial of a proper aspiration for freedom. Somebody told me on the way in that today is the anniversary of something to do with the Statue of Liberty. Sorry, I didn't know that in advance, but there we are. The point is this: the newly enlightened world wanted to work from the ground up and do its own thing and develop in its own way without somebody coming in and crushing it from above. Thus, what the West has meant by freedom was joined at the hip to the Epicurean settlement. Get God out of the picture and his agents in church and state, and then the world can develop the way we want it to. And this received classic expression in science, both at the level of method, look at the data without having the Bible tell you what you're supposed to find, and results, namely that the world makes itself without any apparent divine hand on the tiller. Erasmus Darwin, in the late 18th century, was an Epicurean in most senses of the word, many decades before his famous grandson went off in search of biological specimens. The same thing is played out in historical scholarship by the determined attempt to replace deduction, deducing what must have happened from some antecedent dogmatic framework, with induction, a bottom-up approach of looking at the evidence supposedly without presuppositions, and working up from there without fear or favor. That's what the historical revolution represented by David Hume and Edward Gibbon was all about, resulting in the challenge to long-standing Christian assumptions about the interaction between God and the world. And in politics, the French and American revolutions had exactly the same, as it were, epistemological shape, and for very similar reasons. So too with other moves towards fuller democracy in the Western world. So we now find what some have called the biopolitical, in which political societies would simply develop like biological organisms, working from below without any tyrannical intervention from above or outside. And this has then been allied to the powerful modern belief in progress, a combination of optimistic Hegelianism and still more optimistic social Darwinism, forgetting that both Epicureanism itself and Darwin's survival of the fittest assume that there will be many random developments which prove disastrous and unsustainable. Hegel got around that by assuming that the immanent spirit was at work to produce a utopian future, so that apparently undesirable developments were just blips. They were part of the ongoing dialectic. Well, gee, thanks, we've had a few of those blips in the last century, and they're not very pretty. Thus, the dangerous puzzles we face today, causing some to question democracy itself, as, by the way, did Joseph Kennedy when he was ambassador to the UK before the Second World War, interestingly. Those are the direct analogues of the dangerous puzzles of modern science, which rightly celebrates, for instance, its medical achievements, but simultaneously produces ever more deadly weaponry and the deeply ambiguous internet, and so on. And anyway, in the middle of all this, in the late 18th century, we find the similarly ambiguous reconstructions of Jesus, starting with Reimarus and continuing today. And part of the problem there, and this was my argument in the Giffords, is that the historical question of Jesus on the one hand, and the theological question of God and the world on the other, including, therefore, the question of natural theology, were all posed and addressed in radically flawed ways, precisely through the epistemological turn to a supposedly more objective, bottom-up induction. Any attempt at a more integrated epistemology, and consequently a more rounded historiography, is met with the accusation that, oh, you've smuggled in something from elsewhere, some extra presupposition, some other narrative, which you are now imposing on the facts. And this is resented within that sort of historiography for exactly the same reason that Americans in the 1770s resented George III sending bishops to the colonies. Let's draw a discreet veil over that for this evening. In other words, one is doing deduction rather than induction. And this is where we need a tertium quid. The epistemology of love operates through abduction, to which I shall return. Now, there is, of course, an irony here. I've been talking about the development of what we call modernity, and modernity was rooted in protest against hierarchic rule in church and state. But as often happens with revolutions, modernity itself became relentlessly hierarchical, which then has generated now the postmodern protest, which turns the old rhetoric against itself. That may be why postmodernity has failed to halt the modernist juggernaut, the ideology of progress, for instance, and has instead merely spawned a Machiavellian cynicism in which fake news on the one hand and conspiracy theories on the other flourish unchecked. And all this flows directly, I'm arguing, from the failures of knowledge which I've tracked through their various outworkings. So, middle section of lecture is entitled "The Greatest of These is Love." One of the great losses in Christian modernity is that deism and Epicureanism have eaten away at our Christian worldview. And within that, many Christians have tried to reassert Christian truth, but within that split-level world, with a God who is normally out of the process. To try to think Christianly within the deist worldview then means that people speak in the modern way of natural and supernatural as though this is a zero-sum antithesis. It's got to be the one or the other. That wasn't how, in the medieval world, the concept of supernaturalism worked. In the modern world, the supernatural is what happens when a normally absent God reaches in, does something peculiar, and then goes away. And that's not how early Jews and Christians saw it. So to think Christianly within the Epicurean worldview, many have reached for Plato, accepting the idea of a gulf between God's world and our world, and suggesting simply that we have immortal souls which have somehow a hotline to God's world and which will one day go back there instead. Theological questions then emerge within these variations on split-level worlds, so that, for instance, natural theology itself has often seemed to be inquiring as to whether one might, after all, discover the deist God by inspecting the natural order. And this has produced many, many ongoing muddles and mistakes. But to slice through that, we need to think clearly about what has happened in our culture. Western modernism has been a great and powerful movement, and it deserves to be clothed in the splendid garments of myth. And we've had two of them, Faust and Frankenstein. The medieval legend of Faust, who sold his soul to the devil in return for great power and glory in the present world, was given classic modern expression by Goethe in the 1770s and by Thomas Mann in the 1940s. And the key feature for us is the renunciation of love. Faust is given all that a man could desire, power, wealth, pleasure, provided only that he never says to anyone, to any moment or event, "Verweile doch, du bist so schön." Linger a while, you are so beautiful. And in Mann's brilliant retelling, where Hitler's Germany makes exactly this kind of Faustian pact, the diabolical instruction is even more explicit in the English translation, "Thou mayst not love." And this renunciation of love echoes exactly ancient Epicureanism. The great first-century Epicurean poet Lucretius suggested that love can actually impede erotic pleasure itself. Oscar Wilde said something similar in the late 19th century. In ancient Epicureanism, the pursuit of pleasure was for its own sake, and that required that one should escape the world's wider concerns, not get emotionally involved with them. By contrast, modern Epicureanism has grasped the pleasures of power, conquest, empire, colonizing, and controlling the world. But to do this, you need to kick God upstairs out of the way and deny the possibility of his interference, and you need to reject love. Self-aggrandizing Western conquests can then proceed unchecked. And this in turn produces the second myth, Frankenstein. Western modernity has created a monster. The 20th century saw it rampaging around the world, and it's not gone away. We supposed that this monster would do what we wanted, but now it is taking over, and it seems we are powerless to stop it. W.B. Yeats's idea of the monster lurching towards Bethlehem to be born is actually all too real. Of course, a Jewish or Christian analysis of this worrying situation would want to speak here of idolatry. We have worshipped Mars, and Mars dog whistles us into addressing all problems with tanks and bombs. We have worshipped Mammon, so that turning a profit trumps all else. We have worshipped Aphrodite, and any suggestion that we should resist her is seen as infringing our human rights, and so on. The false gods get their power and apparent authority from the fact that they really are aspects of the good created world, which for a Jew or a Christian is the loving gift of a wise creator. That when we respond to the idols rather than to the creator, we are driven not by lust, but by greed or fear or love. Not by love, but by greed or fear or lust. And that's what idols do. Idols lure you into the Faustian trap. And the way out is a true understanding of creation as the gift of love, to which love is the appropriate response. But you can't get to that true understanding by a direct approach, which quickly leads back to the idols. You have to start with the center of creation, which is Jesus himself. What that means and how we might get there is where this lecture is now going. Two key Pauline passages sum this up. In Galatians 4, after speaking of God sending the Son and then sending the Spirit of the Son, Paul then says, now that you've come to know God, or better, to be known by God, how can you then turn back to the idols, to the elements of the world? That's Galatians 4:9. In other words, the gospel events unveil the true God in all his glory, the God who sends the Son and sends the Spirit of the Son. And since these actions are always God's initiative, our knowledge of this God must always be seen as the reflex of God's knowledge of us. Paul then amplifies that in 1 Corinthians 8, which deals with the problem of idolatry. And Paul mocks the Corinthians' pretension to any kind of special gnosis knowledge. He says, if anybody thinks that they know something, they can get puffed up by that. They don't really know the way they ought to know. But if somebody loves God, they are known by him. And what does it mean to love this God? Paul quotes and adapts the central Jewish prayer, the prayer of love, the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God. Paul incorporates Jesus within this prayer. There is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus the Messiah. And Paul's whole letter is then an exposition of what it means to love this God. To love not by taking the initiative as though we could barge in and simply know things powerfully with our own objective knowledge, but rather responding to the love revealed in the gospel, and to allow that love to become the mode of all other knowledge. And I'll explain in a minute how that is not a collapse into subjectivity, as the objectivists would like to imagine. This received classic expression in the great poem we know as 1 Corinthians 13. Paul here places love at the center of his eschatological epistemology. We know, you see, in part. We prophesy in part, but with perfection, the partial is abolished. As a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned like a child. When I grew up, I threw off childish ways. But why in a poem about love does Paul take this time to contrast these two phases, an earlier phase of life with the later maturity? Answer, because love is the mode of knowing which provides the continuity between the present age and the age to come. Love is the constant between our present incomplete knowledge and the full knowledge yet to come. And as he says, for at the moment all that we can see are puzzling reflections in a mirror. Then, face to face, I know in part for now, but then I'll know completely, through and through, even as I'm completely known. So now, faith, hope, and love remain, these three, and of them, love is the greatest. You see, unlike Aristotle's self-made virtue, Paul's Christian virtue is always a matter of response, always a matter of discovering the love which is the heart of true knowledge, the love inspired within him by the love revealed in and flowing from the gospel. Galatians again, the life I do still live in the flesh, I live within the faithfulness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. That is both center and paradigm. Now, Paul here, of course, focuses on the love within Christian communities, the love that holds together the varied ministries of 1 Corinthians 12, the love that prevents disorderly chaos in worship in chapter 14. But this poem in chapter 13 indicates what it means to know God's world, to know one another within God's world, and to know God himself with a love which, though it awaits fulfillment in the age to come, it has already broken into the present world and time. It isn't fantasy, it isn't subjective, it is true knowledge. And when we see how this love works, we recognize that it transcends the antitheses of modern thought. And that's what I'm commending to you this evening. See, the Enlightenment has often tried to propose its own low-grade replacement for love in the form of tolerance. But tolerance is a hands-off, arm's-length kind of relationship. We can well understand its appeal in the 18th century world, which was weary of revolution and wars of religion, though of course it was itself about to collapse into internecine murder in the French Revolution, and then later into your American Civil War, to look no further, and especially in this building, we're aware of that. But as we all know, tolerance is not enough. Invoking it simply produces a downward spiral of ineffective semi-moralism. We urgently need to explore the possibilities of a genuine epistemology and hermeneutic of love. The two most obvious areas to explore, despite what's happened to them in the last 2 centuries, might be science and history. I am a historian, I'm not a scientist. I did precisely 1 year of science at school, that's all I had to do. I knew I was going on to be a classicist, so I sailed through physics and chemistry with cheerful abandon. My chemistry report at the end of that 1 year said he has maintained his position, which was 24th out of 24, with occasional signs of interest now and then. So, so I have no claim whatever to be a scientist. However, the early modern scientists were often quite explicit about thinking God's thoughts after him. They understood their task as responding to reality, not simply investigating it in a supposedly neutral objectivity. And to see the natural world as creation, not just a self-governing or self-making nature, is already a big step in that direction, particularly because it puts the human researcher on the same footing as one creature to another. This is where the biblical doctrine of the image stands out and is so often misunderstood. The idea of the image goes with the idea of the heaven and earth creation as a vast temple. The final thing you put into a temple when you're making it is an image of the God. Humans are the image in this cosmic shrine, designed to stand at the threshold between heaven and earth, transmitting the loving stewardship of the Creator into his world and translating the unspoken worship of all other creatures into articulate praise. This is what it means to be the royal priesthood. In this context, to speak of humans knowing God or knowing the rest of creation would demand a higher value to the word knowing than the lower grade forms to which we've become accustomed. Image bearers are called to be knowers. That is, to be suffused themselves with a rich personal knowledge of God through which to bring his blessing to the world, and to understand in all appropriate ways what the created order is all about, to sum up and express in Psalms 103 and 104, to look no further, something of the richly various creation in all its reality. And in both cases, this involves speaking words which construct that true reality. This is the prophetic part of the image-bearing vocation, accompanying the royal vocation of being stewards and the priestly vocation of summing up creation's praises. And all this frames a rich biblical vocation of a deep knowing in which the scientist will relish the unexpected and paradigm-shifting discoveries, not least those that go against the grain of all a priori theory. And here we note an irony, as with modernity itself. Even as 18th century science was challenging the theological a prioris of the time, it was eager to set up its own Epicurean ones. So that the evolution of species was approached not simply as a newly discovered bit of inductive knowledge from below, but as the necessary postulate from evolutionism, the Epicurean assumption that if the gods don't act in the world, then the world must make itself. That word must, which is the telltale sign. With that, you have just as much a deduction, a top-down theory, as what was being rejected. If we could hold on to that distinction between evolution as a biological theory and evolutionism as a philosophical must, then a lot of current bother could be set aside. And that's why an epistemology of love, seeing the creation as itself, the outflowing of divine creative love, must pay attention to the creation itself. It isn't enough to know that it's God's creation and to infer from that that we already know everything that's important about it. That is merely patronizing. Love demands patient curiosity. And here is the point. Love transcends the objective-subjective divide because as the image-bearing stewards of creation, as liturgists of creation's praise, as prophets called to speak creation's reality, we humans are called not to a cool, detached appraisal of the world, nor to a merely self-indulgent grasping of it, but to a delighted exploration and exposition in which deep respect and appropriate enjoyment go hand in hand. See how that transcends the brittle objectivity and the squodgy subjectivity? And if this is true with science, it's also very similarly true with history. Ever since Lessing's dictum, following on the historical skepticism of Gibbon and Hume, many have concluded that we can't know very much about what actually happened, since all we can discover are what some people said about things that might have happened and so on. And sometimes this produces an endless regress. Instead of recovering Jesus, we only recover Mark's Jesus, and then Mark's sources Jesus, or whatever. It goes back and back. Actually, like the hare and the tortoise, this. The hare can't possibly overtake the tortoise because all he can do is divide the distance between him. And we all know the hare does overtake the tortoise. And actually, there is real history to be had. This hyper-caution, which is bred from a pseudo-scientific quasi-objectivity, is unwarranted. Yes, of course we allow for the bias of the sources, just as the scientist factors in the perspective of the researcher. But just as particles of light really do exist, even though observing them changes them, thank you, Heisenberg, so the fact that fake news exist doesn't mean that nothing has happened. So too, the fact that people love conspiracy theories doesn't mean that real conspiracies don't exist, and so on. Here, the epistemology of love as applied to history insists, along with some of the early critics of the Enlightenment, like Giambattista Vico, that understanding the past means entering sympathetically into the minds of people who are very different to ourselves. As in any human relationship, it's all too easy to project our hopes and interests onto the other. Pure objectivity about the other would simply appraise people coolly at a distance rather than engaging with them. Pure subjectivity would use them to gratify our own whims or desires. Love means not just allowing them to be themselves, but relishing them as being themselves, as being both other than ourselves and other than our initial hopes and expectations of them. Thus, the historian will study in full detail the thought world of the culture and people under investigation, its symbolic structure, its underlying taken-for-granted narratives, its characteristic praxis, and so on. This is the larger social and cultural structure, which I have loosely and heuristically called worldview, corresponding broadly to what Charles Taylor calls the social imaginary and Pierre Bourdieu the habitus. This is basically a matter of the historian's due diligence. And as with history, as with science, the Christian can never simply say, and this is a swipe at one or two recent writers in this field, that because God is the Lord of history, that's all we need to know, and we shouldn't get down and dirty into the naturalistic business of how do we know what precisely it all meant. Saying that God is the Lord of history, so that's all we need to know, is like asking your bank manager what you have in your account and receiving the answer, money. Refusing to actually, sorry for the split infinitive, I misread, refusing actually to investigate history is a way of staying on the safe side of Lessing's ugly ditch. History, like science, is full of surprises. Only when we pay attention to them, allowing our earlier expectations to be radically modified, including our expectation of what God's world ought to look like, and how God ought to behave. And if there were a God who ... surely he would have wanted ... Beware of arguments like that. Only when you're allowing your expectations to be modified are you actually operating with an epistemology of love. Because this is why I've stressed in both biblical scholarship and Christian faith that it won't do to speak about the incarnation, about Jesus being genuinely human, unless you are prepared to look long and hard at what that incarnate life actually consisted of. It isn't enough to say that, oh, he was fully human, because the Creed says so, and then being satisfied that you have fulfilled Gregory of Nazianzus' criterion of what needed to be healed, needed to be assumed, you can now safely pass on to other matters, without investigating what the kingdom of God meant in the first century and how Jesus redefined it around his own vocation. The four Gospels themselves insist that you should investigate, in a way very few theologians have actually done, what Jesus himself really intended by what he did and said, where he fitted into his culture and where he cut across it with a fresh, personalized reading of Israel's scriptures and so on. I mentioned the late, great Ben Meyer, one of the great Catholic biblical scholars of the last generation. It was he who first alerted me to these questions back in the late 1970s. Of course, as in both science and history and personal relationships, there are many things that a proper loving engagement will want to challenge. The scientist may be fascinated by the way a cancer cell grows, but that fascination will increase the determination to stop it in its tracks. The historian may be intrigued by the causes of the First World War, but she may well hope that by investigating the complex tangle of motivations, we might spot future early warning signs. We didn't actually, but you can go on hoping. And the parent who enjoys watching the child climbing a tree will, as a matter of love, simultaneously affirm their freedom and responsibility and seek to mitigate any obvious excess danger. Love is always on the lookout, both ways. So my main case then is that the Enlightenment's spurious either-or of objective and subjective has to be transcended in an epistemology of love. And I think that with the Enlightenment project under attack on many sides, I've got written down here on all sides, but I'm aware of people like Steven Pinker who are still trying to prop it up as best they can, it's more than time for such a reappraisal. So the attack on the Enlightenment comes today from many quarters. In our world, some angry non-Westerners look at our self-awarded privilege and try to destroy it. happened here 10 dozen years ago. Sometimes they mistake the Enlightenment's self-congratulatory stance for Christian triumphalism, which of course sometimes exists along with. Some non-Westerners, seeing a house full of good things, quite naturally want to climb in and enjoy some for themselves. And a good many Westerners, knowing from the inside the hollowness of the modernist claims and the obvious counterexamples to the boast of progress, world wars, nuclear bombs, the Holocaust, etc., have tried to pull the house down on their own heads through deconstruction and hypercritical analysis, identity politics ranged against the big narrative, and so on. Postmodernity, aping its parent modernity in its protest against tyrannical narratives, has nothing to put in its place except celebration of the ever smaller identities, with its only moral imperative being the scream of the victim. And neither modernity nor postmodernity has any idea what to do when the oil runs out, when the ice caps melt, and when the barbarians turn up at the gates. Now, Augustine, watching something similar from his bishopric in Carthage, wrote The City of God, but his residual Platonism may not supply us with the answers that we need, though his emphasis on love certainly could. And that's what I commend. But this is only a start. As Christians, we may be able to affirm with St. Paul that love is the greatest. We might even want to adopt the slogan, make agape great again. We can set ourselves to the tasks of science and history and much besides with a new integration. We can hold together the falsely opposed objective and subjective within the epistemology of love. And we must explore, as part of that, the meaning of abduction. The great American philosopher C.S. Peirce, as I'm sure you know, used that term for the method of hypothesis and verification, which is the virtuous epistemological circle. And we ought to redefine the meaning of critical realism to make clear, in particular against some doubters, that this is not a way of smuggling in a neo-positivism by the back door, and indeed against a different group of doubters, that the critical bit in critical realism doesn't mean for the Christian historian playing fast and loose with scripture. All this we grant, but it's only a start. So what happens when we run into serious problems? How can we in particular respond to the neo-Machiavellian methods which insist, like Pontius Pilate, what is truth? Which that we, the imperialists, make our own truth. And that if truth claims are power claims, it's better to get your truth claims in first, to tell big lies so that then when people act on them, they become true. To create facts on the ground and let others grumble if they must. How do we stand up, in other words, to the bullying positivisms which elbow everything and everybody out of the way with the old Roman slogan, oderint dum metuant, let them hate so long as they fear? How do we stop our renewed epistemology of love from retreating from all this into being simply a private game which we Christians can play in some safe space? And this brings me to the final part of the lecture. Love is come again. Because the answer comes in the event which Enlightenment modernism had done its best to rule out of order, the resurrection of Jesus. I already quoted Wittgenstein, it's love that believes the resurrection. What might that mean? How might it help? I've argued that the polarized epistemologies we've inherited from the Enlightenment are not fit for purpose in geopolitics as well as history, in philosophy as well as science, and that a freshly reappraised epistemology of love is required for a fuller, wiser, and more fruitful knowing. And this has ramifications in our education systems and syllabuses and our public life. It's all about taking creation seriously, which for the Christian means receiving it as what it is, the gift of love from the good and wise Creator. Our delighted, sensitive, and respectful and curious exploration of creation is the response of love to the love we have received. But often, of course, creation as it presents itself to us does not appear to be a gift of love. There are what we call natural disasters. The Lisbon earthquake in the 1750s was one of the prime drivers of certain aspects of Enlightenment thought. There is human wickedness and sin. There is sickness and pain, and ultimately there is death. So a good deal of human exploration of the world, whether in science or history or art or politics, has either lashed out against perceived evil or at least tried to limit damage or indeed simply to escape. Some of the present moves to investigate transhumanism or finding and deactivating the gene that causes death seem to me to fall into that kind of category. These are not, it seems to me, responses of love, but of fear and fantasy. But the resurrection of Jesus holds out a different possibility. As I said earlier, the Enlightenment rejected it because there can't be two climaxes to history, and if the climax of history was Locke and Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson, then sorry, the resurrection can't be allowed on stage. But it's not only the failure of the Enlightenment that ought to question that judgment. It is the fact that the resurrection of Jesus unveils to the world the new creation, which is the reaffirmation of the Creator's love in the first creation. This is so obvious in one way, but ignored in many others, that it needs spelling out just a tiny bit more. I've argued that creation itself, in all its rich variety, does in fact speak to us of the Creator's love. It's there in Psalm 19 and many, many other passages. So that for us to know God's world ought to be a matter of an answering love. But the horrors of the world, and particularly death, call that into question. To affirm creation's goodness without acknowledging that problem fully risks collapsing into sentimentalism. We see that in some parts of the world, never mind. But the New Testament sees Jesus' bodily resurrection as the reaffirmation of that creational love, and hence the retrospective validation of the love which was already speaking its name in creation itself. Because Jesus' resurrection deals with the ultimate question mark by overcoming death and launching a new creation in which, as John Donne said, death shall be no more. And thus, though I don't think this was exactly what Wittgenstein had in mind, belief in Jesus' resurrection is not a private option for those blessed with particular credulity, nor simply the affirmation that after his death, Jesus' kingdom project somehow continued, nor any of the other funny things which the modern and postmodern world, and as often as not the church, alas, has imagined that it might be. The resurrection of Jesus, as the New Testament is keen to tell us, was nothing less than the launch of new creation in which all wrongs will be put right. And in this new world, the Creator's love, which had always been on display in the original creation, is displayed in all its glory. And here a biblical view of Easter has to struggle not just against skepticism, which, as I said, was just as strong in the ancient world as in the modern, but against Christian misunderstandings, going back in Western theology to the Middle Ages, when heaven and hell became the big categories, and the very idea of new heaven and new earth somehow was forgotten, despite its biblical prominence. So, the love which believes the resurrection, like the love which responds to creation in science and history, only much more so, is the answering love to the Creator's love in launching the new creation. And this opens up, as I've argued in the Giffords, a new vision of natural theology. Not only are the present signals of transcendence, as some people call them, retrospectively validated, but the puzzles within the present creation, the ways in which these signposts have let us down, are met and answered by the message of the crucifixion of the one who was then raised. We see in retrospect from the resurrection of Jesus that the questions we wanted to ask before were the right questions to ask. And all of this, of course, depends on factoring in Jesus' historical kingdom work, focused eventually on his confrontation with the Jerusalem temple. And this, in turn, depends on understanding his strongly implicit claim that through and in him, Israel's creator God was finally returning to rescue and reestablish not only God's people, but God's whole creation. Those last two sentences contain an entire project on Christology, which I'm hoping I may be able to address in my semi-retirement. Dream on, yeah. This fresh vision of creation and new creation, grasped by the love which answers the Creator's own love, makes its way not simply by rational persuasion. Rationalism alone, reason matters, but it's not the only thing. It makes its way through the life-giving and life-transforming work of the gospel in the power of the Spirit. Despite the post-Enlightenment sneers and denials, Christianity, just part of the problem, not part of the solution. Despite that, that has been happening for the last 2 millennia. The historian Tom Holland has become a Christian through studying that stuff, and in his new book makes that very clear. And Rodney Stark's book from 20 years ago, The Rise of Christianity, says a lot of things which the Enlightenment wants to forget. That most of the great things that have happened in our world in the last 2 millennia can be traced to the influence of the gospel one way and another. And the more the church gives itself to the healing and creative work of love, the more its resurrection message will be credible, and the more the truth of the God-givenness of creation will become apparent. And as that work continues, so the epistemology of love should take the lead in science and history and politics and economics, and indeed theology itself. A little bit of a tailpiece here, 2 tailpieces actually, this is the first of 2, something which I've just been puzzling about recently because of the work of one of my students in St. Andrews. I mentioned this in a sermon I preached yesterday, so some of you have heard this before. Grief is also a mode of love. The epistemology of love includes within itself the epistemology of grief. The sorrow we rightly experience at the horrors and wickednesses of the world, including our own folly and failure. This sorrow is the shadow side of love for God's world as it was and was meant to be. Epicureanism always tried to avoid sorrow. Life is random and meaningless, so shrug your shoulders, get what pleasure you can, and ignore all the difficult bits. Jews and Christians always saw things the other way up. As in Romans 8, the grief of God's people as they share the pain and groaning of the world is the appropriate vehicle for God's own grief in the person of the Spirit. The Spirit groans within us as we groan within the groaning of creation. This is a deep paradox deserving fuller explanation, but it is, I believe, an integral part of the epistemology of love. Our true knowledge, neither holding the world at arm's length in a spurious objectivity, nor merely sensing and feeling it in an unhelpful subjectivity. Our true knowledge includes centrally that prayer of unknowing of which Paul speaks. We do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit intercedes with inarticulate groanings. That is part of the epistemology of grief, which is part of love. Just as God called Israel to be the means of rescuing the world so that he might himself rescue the world by becoming Israel's representative, the Messiah, so I believe God gave Israel the tradition of lament and then brought this into a yet deeper level in Jesus, in Gethsemane and on the cross, and then in his people, so that God himself might lament from within the heart of his world through the groaning of his own Spirit. Do you see? The epistemology of love, no wonder it was missed in the 18th century, because with deism still rampant, Trinitarianism was precisely what was not wanted on stage. I'm arguing that the epistemology of love is a richly Trinitarian mode of knowing. God the Creator calls us to be his image bearers indeed, summing up both the praises and the laments of the world, reflecting his wise, stewarding love back into that world, and speaking prophetically the words which bring healing, order, truth, and new creation. That can be developed much more. So to conclude, I've been commending to you an epistemology of love, correlating critical realism with abduction, applied to the multiple areas where the Enlightenment split world has brought confusion and corruption and actually danger. The postmodern critique of the Enlightenment has failed either to stop the juggernaut or to point a positive way forward, but the tools are available for that to be done. The Church now needs to step over the wreckage of the trivial liberalism of the last generation and to lead the way through the postmodern morass and out the other side, not into a new or chastened modernism. Please let's not imagine that, but into a reclaiming of the older Christian tradition of the missiology of love growing directly out of the correlated epistemology. So the final tailpiece. The rhetoric of freedom, common to all empires, comes to us shaped by the divided worldview of 18th century Epicureanism. Not only has it then tended, as we know, to highlight freedom from rather than freedom for, the much claimed freedoms of the countries of the Enlightenment have been framed within that Epicurean worldview. We have thus sought freedom not only from the gods and their interference, also from tyranny, in France from the monarchy, in America from the British, and so on, but also from religious authorities. The sharp separation of church and state tellingly reflects one construal of Lessing's ugly ditch. The modern West has also embraced the other Epicurean freedom. We are the enlightened elite, and we, like the gods, can detach ourselves from the rabble down the road, or across the border, or across the Mediterranean. This temporary luxury is rapidly coming to an end. So if my critique of modern Epicureanism is accurate, it should force us to reappraise what we mean by freedom itself. If it is love that believes the resurrection, answering the love revealed in new creation itself, what might it look like to have a freedom shaped by that love? Here, as elsewhere, Paul and John, and indeed Jesus himself, might have some suggestions to make, but that would be a topic for another occasion. Thank you.
Professor Wright has agreed to take some questions. I'll field the questions and he'll answer them. Question? Yes.
Have we passed the safeguardism, or is there a way this can be used as a pact through it?
Have we passed?
Pierre de Chardin.
Teilhard de Chardin had an extraordinary proposal in the first half of the 20th century, which I think was always in danger of constructing a great notional picture of the cosmos, in which eventually we would all evolve, the whole world would evolve into an omega point in which everything would work out and so on. The problem with that, as Teilhard de Chardin knew himself, because I think he'd been a stretcher bearer in the First World War, if I remember rightly, was that what about all the stuff that happens en route? It's an odd way of saying God's going to solve everything when in fact nothing is solved. In my book, Surprised by Hope, I liken it rather cheekily to the true, I think, story of the old Oxford professor in the 19th century, who every time his desk was getting a bit too unruly, simply spread a copy of the London Times out over the whole lot and started again. And after his death, they did a sort of archaeological dig through all the unanswered letters and unpaid bills and so on that were underneath. But I mean, that would be God's problem in an ultimate Teilhard de Chardin-esque omega point, it seems to me. So, I mean, but that has been a very interesting and in some cases quite influential idea. It was an attempt not to be a dualist. at a time when a lot of Christianity was very dualist, saying that God is just going to trash the world and take us somewhere else. You want to say, no, the world is God's world, and God's got to redeem it. But I think his modus operandi for that redemption really does fail the test.
Yes.
Thank you for your bit about lament. It was a strong bit. I've heard it said that this ought to be a season of lament, particularly for Christians in the state of disunity that we are perpetuating and have come to take for granted. I wonder how this epistemology of love, as you've articulated, is to first be applied to us if we are to stand up and lift up Christ in one Ecumenism.
Yeah, you mean how it's to be applied to us in our divided Christendom?
Yes.
Yes.
And then
Exactly.
the rest maybe will take care of itself, but
Well,
we perpetuate.
That'd be a start. Yes, absolutely. When I published my big book on Paul 5-6 years ago, whenever it was, I went around doing various conferences, and people often said to me, if Paul could come back and see us today, what would surprise him most? And I would unhesitatingly reply, not only the fact that we are divided, but the fact that we don't care, that we just take that for granted. Because every letter Paul wrote was about bringing God's people together across difficult cultural, historical, personal divides. And tragically, the churches of the Reformation, which have lionized Paul because of justification by faith, have failed to see that justification at its heart is the doctrine that all those who believe in Jesus belong at the same table. And they've actually used it as a way of pulling things apart. So yes, that's a real imperative. I much value what Walter Casper and others have argued for in this last generation in terms of receptive ecumenism as a way of saying, as we look at one another in our present state, perhaps God has given to you gifts which he wants me to receive from him but through you, and maybe vice versa as well. That's a big project. There's some people in Durham right now working hard on that. But that and other ways forward have to be explored with all possible energy. Because as I've often said, and it's there in Ephesians, if the church is divided, Caesar takes no notice of us.
Yes, in the back.
This follows up your comment on Walter Casper. In your epistemology of love, how do you embrace, understand empathetically the loves of the idolaters?
The loves of the idolaters, with sympathy as one who himself is constantly lured by the idols. In other words, I think Augustine would say, I'm not an Augustine scholar, but I think, and those who are can correct me, I think Augustine would say that the loves of the idolaters, as you put it, are distortions of a genuine something which is there in creation, that we are made to live in this world and to relish it and to enjoy it for what it is, but to enjoy it as God's gift and in God's way. And the danger then with the love of an idolater, and we are all idolaters, I say, in one way or another, is that we want to grasp the world and use it for our own ends, and that love then becomes greed or lust or whatever. And the answer to that is not that the world is a bad and dark and shabby place and we're going to be Platonic dualists and we want to get the hell out of here, but that God is going to redeem this world and the wolf and the lamb will lie down together and so on and so on. And we have to be people who struggle in the present to find ways of articulating and living into that.
Let's take a final question right here in front.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you for that talk. I just was
So
interested.
do you want the microphone so people can hear? Here's the young lady with it.
Thank you. I was interested in how you were identifying and describing accurately some of the problems that we have today coming from the Enlightenment and also from Epicureanism. But I just wondered, when people preach that, or when they identify it, or they advocate things that we think came from that, do they identify it, because they've been here, do they identify that as something coming from Epicureanism or the Enlightenment, or do they call it something else?
Yeah, today, the popular analysis would be to call it secularism. And there is something in that, because as Charles Taylor argued in his Gifford lectures 10 or a dozen years ago, A Secular Age, there has never before been a time in history when it's been possible for a whole swathe of humanity to live et si Deus non daretur, as though there were no God, and actually just to run your whole life without any overt religious. Now, I would say that, in fact, even when people are doing that, there is an amazing amount of religious symbolism going on in what they do and who they are, because that's who we are as humans. But I've found that analyzing it in terms of Epicureanism helps, because that shows that what secularism has done is subtly retrieve a lot of one particular ancient worldview while claiming that it is the modern scientific worldview and therefore must override everything else. And the answer is it isn't. And the fact that science has made enormous advances, negative as well as positive, but particularly in the medical sciences, has done so much wonderful stuff and enabled us to do so many amazing things, that cannot be used as a crowbar to say that therefore we have to adopt a worldview in which if there are gods, they're out of the picture altogether. The early scientists would have been horrified at that. And that's been a kind of intellectual coup d'etat, which I think, identifying the contemporary world as essentially Epicureanism, enables us to resist. That's difficult. And it's difficult because, as Catherine Wilson, one of the philosophers who's written this, her book is, I think, Epicureanism in the Age of the Enlightenment, something like that. She says the reason all this sounds so strange to analyze it as philosophy is because it's what we all take for granted. And that's what has to be challenged. The taken for grantedness of it, and then particularly the fact that so many Christians, particularly in the 19th century, wanting to escape from the sterility of what they saw as secularism, appealed to, oh, we believe in the supernatural, meaning that in a new sense of a God who is outside the process, occasionally reaching in and doing something, which is a deeply unbiblical way of thinking, and then particularly embracing the Platonic idea that we have these things called souls which really belong in heaven and looking forward to going back there. As I tell my students repeatedly, you go to the first century looking for somebody who says that our reality is that we have a disembodied soul which wants to find its way back to heaven. The person who argues that is Plutarch, not Paul. Plutarch, the Middle Platonist, in his treatise on exile. And this is such a shock to many, many, many Western Christians that it takes a lot of rethinking. And that's, I think, what I'm challenging us all to do. Thank you.